Now, what should the punishment be for motorists who speed excessively? MPs will debate today whether the law should be toughened up to try and stop drivers risking their lives and those of other road users. Well, we asked people in Cardiff if the law needs to be tightened.
Anyone going over 100 miles an hour, it's just not safe. And also the actual roads themselves and the infrastructure of the roads means that the cars aren't as safe driving at those speeds versus somewhere in Europe. We just don't have the structure in Wales to be doing that.
It depends on the speed. I mean, if you're doing 10 miles over the limit, yes, a fine and 3 points on your license, fine. But if you're doing excessive speed, like 120 or even over 100, then you should, without doubt, lose your license, and for a considerable time.
Clearly, there should be tougher penalties, including losing your license for an offence like that.
Well, Jeanette Miller is the managing director at Jeffrey Miller Solicitors, a law firm specialising in motoring law, so she knows all about this. Good morning, Jeanette.
Morning, Claire.
Do you help a lot of people then who've been handed speeding tickets?
We do, and I think that the way that we approach each case, it tends to depend on the allegation and just how much over the speed limit they've been accused of being, and also that their driving history, whether they have accumulated other points, and whether there are alternative options such as speed awareness courses. Sometimes that might be a better option than actually involving my firm to help with a court case. So it really does depend. But yes, we deal with a fair few.
A fair few. And just explain for our listeners the law surrounding speeding.
So if you are detected speeding, then it's possible for a police officer to pull you over and have a discussion with you at the roadside and issue a verbal notice of intended prosecution. It's possible that they may issue a fixed penalty on the spot. Fixed penalties involve points on your licence, 3 points, and a fine of £100, whereas if you are considered to be going way in excess of the speed limit, depending on what that limit is, then it may well result in court action where a court has to decide a tougher penalty than perhaps the 3 points that a police officer can issue. There's also the situation where you can get notices in the post because you've not been stopped at the time, but you've been detected by a camera, and that then follows through within 14 days. So that's also one of the scenarios that we deal with. Same penalties apply, it's a different way of being detected and notified.
And you can challenge a speeding ticket?
Yes, you can. We don't challenge them that often, simply because the technology surrounding speed detection devices these days is difficult to argue that it's inaccurate. Where there's human input, so if a police officer is operating a speed detection device, then that is a different matter, and those can be wildly inaccurate in some cases. But where it's a fixed camera, it is quite difficult to challenge and say that the camera must be wrong, and the courts are very much alert to that and loath to accept arguments of inaccuracy. There are other technical arguments as well, but again, they're really rather unpopular in the court system, and we tend not to get involved in that many defended speeding challenges. It's usually a case of trying to argue mitigation, which means we're putting forward the driver's circumstances and trying to argue for a more lenient penalty.
Morning, Jeanette. Do you think the rules need to be tightened up a bit? Because we do often see these cases where people are caught doing ridiculous speeds, that we saw maybe an example in, over 130 miles an hour in Flintshire, people doing those speeds, not in that case, but then people don't go to prison despite the fact this is dangerous.
I personally don't believe that penalties should be made more severe. I think penalties aren't necessarily a deterrent. I think education is far, far more important, and I think that's more likely to have an impact on an offender's future behaviour than perhaps a tougher penalty. And I certainly don't think prison should apply to offences of speeding. Dangerous driving a different matter, but there is a fine line between what is dangerous and what is merely speeding, albeit at a high level. So there already are quite tough penalties, and the court is allowed to impose a disqualification that's unlimited. There isn't a maximum penalty for speeding that could be imposed in terms of a length of ban. But the court listens to the evidence, obviously, and will hear if there is an allegation of very high speed. They will be presented with evidence of how that penalty should be imposed and the punishment should fit the crime. And I don't think that there needs to be any interference with that. There's already quite clear guidelines that the magistrates are directed to follow. and they do distinguish between low-level speeding and sort of mid-range speeding, and then the ones that really hit the magic number of, let's say, 100 miles an hour plus, where there is a guideline penalty of a 7 to 56-day ban, but the court can impose longer than that, especially if they hear more severe, serious circumstances surrounding the allegation.
Do you think it's consistent enough, though? Because you do hear of those cases where people are able to say that, I care for a relative, or I need to drive because of my job, and it seems like those go unpunished because they can kind of bend the system almost. Do you think that happens?
I don't think the system can be bent in that way. I think the situation that I think you're referring to is when somebody accumulates points, although it can be argued in the high-level speeding as well, where the offender's circumstances are relevant. And in cases where you get 12 or more points in a 3-year period, the penalty is actually 6 months. That's a 6-month ban. However, the court is currently allowed to exercise its discretion and accept that a 6-month disqualification could cause the offender or others exceptional hardship. And I think that's really important, because it is those other people that are often penalised by the offender's behaviour, and the court accepts that in those circumstances, sometimes the punishment doesn't fit the crime. And with the case you've given the example of an elderly relative, is it right that somebody should be left with no way of getting about and no way of getting to hospital appointments, and an elderly person is pretty much isolated without their child being able to...
Even if they're putting drivers at risk they're putting other people at risk?
Well, this is where I think education comes in. I don't think the penalties necessarily reduce that risk. I think education does, and that, in my view, is what the MP should be arguing about, is investing more heavily in education.
Fine, so education, definitely. Thanks, Jeanette.
Jeanette Miller, thank you very much indeed.